All righty. Yeah, I'm happy to see all of you. We've got a lovely number of people joining us over the Zoom. So tonight is one of Hello Hacks' our actual first of 2020 virtual meetups. So these are things that we started doing when COVID kicked off. No one knew it was going to be 2 years later. We're still here. We're still doing these virtual events. And we're excited to start thinking about in person in future. But right now, we're very excited to be talking about hiring in general, career growth, how to think about the interview process, how to navigate the job market, and how to think about entering the job market, and also how to think about changing careers entirely. So part of this discussion is about early entrants. Part of this discussion is about, as you get later in your career, how you think about getting to, different types of jobs, or maybe more senior jobs, or accelerating your career. And also just tips on how to think about the interview process in general. Interviewing is one of those things that we actually don't do very often in our career. There are some people that interview people a lot, but there's not a lot of time that you're interviewing yourself, and it's a key skill. So I'm really excited to have some amazing panelists tonight to join with us. And I'll cross the bar for those that are interested. Hello Hacks, outside of just being a Slack community, is actually backed by a federally registered nonprofit. That nonprofit's implicit mission is to help grow the Atlantic technology community by running events like this and building other mechanisms, other programming that helps people figure out, how do I become, succeed in my career and succeed in my life. And so this falls under that banner. Amazing. So panelists, I'm Ian. I've done some things. We'll do some introductions. We're also Jenny Sanford, head of HR at Fellow. We have Chris Dale, who's currently the VP of Engineering at Motrix, and Isaac Grant, who's the CEO and co-founder of Silver Orange. And I'll have them all do lovely introductions in a second. So without further ado, the one last thing I will say before we actually get into this whole thing is that Hello Hacks is sponsored, as I said, backed by federally registered nonprofit. That nonprofit is sponsored from some amazing folks like Dash Hudson and ResMed and RedSpace, Concrete Ventures, Proposify, CodeCov, Sandhill Financial, LaBarge Weinstein, Lixar, Jonas Software, and Tarka Labs. And we appreciate their support. They help us create events like this, and that's really important to our mission. So with all that said, I am going to stop sharing. I'm going to ask my lovely panelists to unmute, and we're going to round introductions. I'll go last. Jenny, I'd love for you to give us a two-minute or 1 minute introduction to yourself, your background, and some of your fun experience. One of your fun experiences hiring. I think that's how we're going to kick this off.
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Jenny Sanford. I am the head of HR at a company called Fellow. It's actually not Atlantic based, but I do live here in Dartmouth. And before working at Fellow, which I started last fall, I was doing HR and operations at Proposify, which you guys all know that name. Prior to that, I had worked in environments that were like, 400 to 40,000 people that were more corporate based. Took the leap to Proposify, love the startup world. So that's kind of the ecosystem I live in now. Day to day, right now, I am involved in the hiring and employment branding and kind of all aspects of HR for people. And my best hiring stories, the ones that are the best are kind of like the ones that things went the most off the rails, just because I do so many of them. So I don't know if they're appropriate, but generally, like when I think of interviews that go really well with me and a candidate, if they're just being themselves and it feels more like a conversation, even though I'm still definitely going through like my list and taking my notes in that, but they're not kind of like putting on a script and like trying to act like their way. They're just relaxed themselves and kind of answering as the questions come to.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Isa, I'd love to hear your introduction and an answer to sort of what you thought was one of your best or what you think fun interview experience.
I'm Isa Grant. My pronouns are they, them. I'm probably unique here in that I've never worked for anyone else, but also worked completely for one company the entire time. I happened to co-found a company with friends at 19, and we're still doing it and loving it. So I feel very lucky and privileged in that way. We're also probably smaller than most people here. We're a small agency, approaching 30 people, but our hiring needs have been slow and steady as opposed to startup style hiring or a big corporate environment. So hopefully I can bring some of that perspective to the fore. And over my career, I've been everything from a developer to a project manager to now the CEO of the organization, and have experience in all those roles and have done hiring of pretty much every role in our organization over time. And honestly, my favorite experience of interviewing someone who completely had the confidence to turn the tables on us as a hiring committee or panel and asked us questions for basically the entire hour. And they're one of my all-time favorite hires as well. They're a standout developer that was very early in their career, but really were honest and vulnerable with themselves in how they approached asking us why we should hire them. And I love that experience.
I love that story. That's amazing. And Chris, I'd love your introduction and one of your favorite sort of hiring experiences.
Sure. So I've been software development for probably 15, 20 years, something like that, kind of everywhere from software developer, architect, but more in management lately. So I've done a lot of hiring, hired a lot of people. And I have kind of a mix of startup, small company, worked for a while at Dell EMC, so that larger corporations. So I've kind of got a mix of organizations of the various different sizes and their own challenges in hiring, because they all have hiring problems, but they're all different. So it's also hiring in different geographies and in San Francisco, Texas, India, and the challenges in some of these different regions in these multinational companies. So I think probably the best hire I had was there was this person who had applied, and on paper, they didn't have much other than a computer science degree. I think it was from like St. FX or something. It was like not a typical school. And they had basically been working at the movie theater as a manager for like 2 years since their degree. So it was kind of a little bit of a risky, but they really impressed me. And so we ended up hiring this person, and they worked out really well, like, neat to see like somebody who was really passionate in the interview about like really going for it and really trying hard, and that really made the difference, and well, getting them the job, and then also they worked out. So that's one cool story.
Awesome. I love that story. And finally, I'll introduce myself. I am not the star of the show. These three are. I'm Ian Livingston, local entrepreneur. I've started some companies. Recently, I've been helping Hella Hacks do its thing. Technical background, done some hiring, done some other fun stuff. I'd love to kick us off today with sort of like an assessment of the job market. And so for many that have been may or may not have been paying attention, the last 2 years have been quite incredible. If you've watched the stock market, you'd know that assets went nuts. If you've been paying attention, companies have been hiring like crazy. There's a huge demand for people in software, and not just software engineers, but across the entire technology sort of ecosystem of information technology, as we needed new tools to help us navigate the pandemic. Most of that came down to how do we connect to one another when we can't get together. And so as a result, hugely in demand. And I want to start us off with the place of, while this is a job seekers market, it's in very much ways, it's sort of like the seller's market in real estate. Well, it's been a job seekers market. I'd love to understand. I'd like to pass this one to you, Jenny, to kick us off with. What are some ways that you've seen that candidates can advocate for themselves and position themselves to create their most advantageous outcomes? I think one of the challenges for many people in hiring is, well, I think I'm amazing, and I hope everyone here thinks they're amazing. But how do I tell someone or convince someone that I am amazing, and I know that I'm getting what I'm worth? I think that's a great place for us to start.
Yeah, I would say people still aren't great at advocating for themselves, but I have noticed over the past couple of years, there's been an absolute incline with people asking more specific questions about the environment they're coming into. So what it's like working here, and, who would I work with? What am I day to day? And getting more information about the environment we offer and the comp package we offer, so they can make a decision. And it's less so like, I'm so excited, I just want to get a job, versus like, is this the right job for me? And I've definitely noticed that from the new grads coming out of software engineering, like right up to experienced people in any job that I've been talking to, that they are much more confident and making it a two-way conversation and saying, okay, well, you said this, what does that mean in your company? Do you offer these benefits? That sort of stuff. I would say there is still a little bit of a deficit. People are probably better than they used to be. And people being confident of their salary ask. Normally I go through all like the benefits spiel on the first call with them and say, like, here's all the benefits we offer. Here's all the non-comp, here's the comp stuff. You said your salary expectations are X. Now that you know information, is that still more your expectation? Is that still the area you're thinking of, to make sure it's open-ended, that they can say higher, or they can say, oh, I just threw that out, you know, whatever. And I would say probably 5 to 10% of people still say some sort of thing like, well, I could take less. Like, stop talking. This is be confident. And a few candidates I actually have even said, like, no, you're asking for too little, ask for more next time you have this conversation. But people definitely do seem to be at least a little more selective in them making the choice to want to keep going on the path with this company in terms of having more conversations and still interested in the job and that. And I would say that's due to the fact that they do hear everything, that there's more jobs happening, and also they're getting more than one interview at once. But then there are a few people that I find are not super confident, that they feel embarrassed, like that they're talking to another company at the same time they're talking to us, and how to respectfully say that to us. But at the same time, you know, we're interviewing other people for this job too. So, like, don't feel bad about speaking up and saying, like, hey, I want this to be the right place for me too. Let's have some honest and frank conversations. Yeah.
Awesome. I'd love to get your perspective on this topic and your experience coming from sort of the smaller company, background.
Yeah, I think we might be a little unusual in this, in that we don't really do negotiated salaries, and our target is not to reach the maximum compensation, but have decent compensation combined with a lot of non-comp that people feel really happy about in an environment that people want. And we know we miss a lot of candidates for that, but we attract candidates that are more interested in the non-comp parts that we attract. But within that environment, and I think this tracks to any job, the part that has happened a few times is us making an offer. And in our job ads, we include the range that we expect. So that is very open from day one. So people applying are aware of that. But we do make an offer at a certain point, and we've had people say that doesn't actually feel right and actually advocate for themselves. And that's never a bad conversation. I'm always happy when someone brings that up. And the really effective way to, I guess, in the end, negotiate is to talk about, why are you judging me in this lens, and why do you see me as worth this value? Like, asking that question directly, like, within the schema that you use for evaluating talent, like, what do I need to go to the next step, or why am I being here, as opposed to the next step up, or a couple of steps beyond that, and forcing the people interviewing or offering you a job to explain their math. And then whether or not you're happy with that is kind of on you.
Amazing. Love that. And Chris, I'd love to understand how you add. I know you have some startup experience, you have some larger company experience. I'd love to, sort of a bread. How do you see this evolving, especially in the last 2 years?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a buyer's market. I want to go back to something that Jenny said a minute ago, advocating for yourself. There is a big cultural divide between the Maritimes and a lot of other regions. So I've prior to COVID, but even now more so, where you're looking at a lot of remote opportunities where they're hiring across the country. The Maritimes, people tend to be a little bit more reserved and less boastful of their own capabilities. And I've seen this firsthand, where I've had excellent people that I brought into other companies that were headquartered in San Francisco, and they don't interview well because they don't talk enough about themselves. They don't talk themselves up enough. I've also interviewed people from San Francisco, and everybody coming in with these resumes and are just like talking about all the amazing things that they can do. And a lot of it is not real at all. Like, they really like to talk themselves up about what they can do and how they're, the greatest thing ever. Whether or not they actually can back that up or not. I think in the Maritimes, people tend to kind of put only what's on the paper, what they're really, really confident in. But that's not your competition. Your competition is not doing that. So it's something to be aware of. Learn how to, advocate for yourself better, and really be able to push for what you think you deserve. So I think that's important. I think another thing too is to make employers wait. Like, if you get a bunch of offers, you kind of have the advantage right now. So if they're like, here's an offer, you need to get us back to us tomorrow, or in 2 days or whatever. Like, take a lot of interviews, interview at a lot of places, get a lot of offers, and then take your time, because, if they found a good candidate, they're going to want to get you to close fast, but you really have the power. You have the power to make them wait, and to get the right opportunity, make sure you look at all your options.
Those are great points, Chris. I'd really, Jenny, I'd love to, and I'd love to hear, maybe first to Jenny, I'd love to hear your perspective on the actual, like, that closing piece. I think that's a common thing, like the pressure time bomb that, like, as a hirer, I would put on somebody, it's sort of a and how to negotiate that aspect. Because I think oftentimes that pressure that is applied with, like, 7 days or 3 days or whatever the time limit is, how to think about that process, especially if you're in a multi-offer perspective versus a single offer, and how you think about it from the perspective as a hirer, and how you think people should think about it from the perspective as someone looking for a job.
I think there's kind of information that applies to both perspectives, is the fact that just because we offered you doesn't mean we don't have another candidate we may be interested in. If you don't want this job and they may be almost as great, and making them wait 2 weeks is not feasible either, then we lose everybody. So we put our offers out for a week, but we really want you to essentially give us a verbal yes within a couple days, and then just take the time to look at your contract, make sure everything's good in the contract, that sort of stuff. Because it isn't just happening in a vacuum for either side of things. So I don't think it's necessary. I think it swings the balance too far the other way to say, we'll just wait for a bunch of offers to come in, even if that's 2-3 weeks, because that's going to mean that probably there's not going to be those first offers you got there. At the end of the day, it's going to be just a decision you have to make. Absolutely interview with a bunch of companies, get some offers, see where your value lies in the market. And even doing a pre-screen at that level, there's probably going to be a salary discussion, and you can get a fairly good idea of the range they'd be willing to offer. So I would say you need to be confident in yourself, knowing your value. And then when offers come in, you don't have to be as stressed about, like, seeing what the best offer is. We've had a couple of candidates, or I guess I'll say, in my career, where they're like, here's the thing, you're not the company I want to work for. I'm waiting from an offer from another company. They're my dream company. I'd love to work here, but I can't say yes and risk losing that opportunity. And in those circumstances, I've said, totally cool, we get it, we're going to move on, circle back to us if that doesn't happen for you, but we also can't wait around, especially in the market right now. Like, we have candidates we'll put into the funnel of the hiring process on Monday, and they're off the market by Thursday. Some companies are out there doing full day interviews and putting an offer out at the end of the day. Some companies are doing 3 afternoons in a row, and some companies are just throwing out offers all over the place. So I don't know if you can necessarily remain competitive as a candidate if you push it out any further than their closing offer period. Of course, there's a pressure with that, but if you have a specific circumstance that you're like, I really need an extra day for a specific reason, reach out to your recruiter and have a frank conversation with them, because they also want you to come into the company happy and ready, and this is where you want to be. They don't want you to take something just because you feel like you have to. They want you to stay, right? So.
And I would agree that we're seeing candidates disappear that quickly, like that there are people out there hiring within a day or faster, like even between trying to arrange a first interview with someone in an intake funnel and them not being on the market the next day is happening, which does mean the candidates are in a position of power. And I do think a soft yes followed by like further questions as opposed to a signed offer will often stretch that process out and give you a bit more room to negotiate. As well as, the frank thing, if someone is excited for you as a candidate, they might have backups, but they probably want to land you as a candidate. And so as long as you're genuine in that conversation and you're not feeling like you're playing them or not dragging it out too long, there is a little bit of room to negotiate there. But at a certain point as a company hiring, I'm going to move on to my second favorite one, just because I have to get that position filled as quickly as possible for my projects.
I love that. I would just as a follow on, I'd love to kind of in the same similar vein to sort of the discussion around offer period, discussion around negotiation of salary. But I think an important question that comes from the chat, how can one keep a good balance between being boastful and being genuine and authentic about themselves during the interview? I'd love to kick this off with you to get your perspective on this one.
I saw that question in the chat and I've been thinking about it since it came up because I know it when I see it. Like I know the difference between an authentic pride in being able to solve a problem versus a boastful claim that I can do anything. And I think it is an element of having the right kind of confidence coming into it where you're backing it up with a story about how you've solved a similar thing. It's similar to how we approach sales as an agency where I know that I can convince people that we can build anything for them. And it's not because I've built the same thing before, it's because I can draw examples of we came into this other industry and had no idea what it was and figured it out and built it for you. And if you can be boastful in that manner where you're talking about even projects that are completely 180 degrees different than the role that you're hiring for, talk about the way that you built up your knowledge and success within that. That's the type of boastful that works for me as opposed to just claiming that I can build anything.
Amazing. Chris, I'd love to, I know from a technical perspective, most of us have all done technical hiring, actually all of us have, but from your perspective being as a VP of engineering, I think specifically when you think about technical hiring, how should someone think about representing themselves in an authentic way, but also that is true, actually putting their best foot forward and telling you, this is what I'm capable of, here's why I'm valuable, and here's why you want me as your employee.
Yeah, I think confidence has a lot to do with it. Is like, if you know something, being able to show yourself confidently that you know that. I think sometimes we tend to put qualifiers on things like, oh, yeah, I'm pretty good at that. I'm okay. It's like, you've been doing it for 10 years. Maybe you're a little bit better than just okay, right? Like, sure, there may be people elsewhere that may be better than you, but if you've been working in something 5-10 years and you're fairly accomplished in it, you can say you're an expert or you're, know it very well. And showing that with confidence, backing that up with confidence. So showing that I am very good at this, being confident about it as opposed to just saying, I'm okay. I'm pretty good, so.
Are there, can you think of examples or pitfalls that you've observed, Chris? And I'd love to pass this to Jenny and Isa afterwards. In terms of this sort of vein of like, here's some things I've noticed, right? I think, as you mentioned, like I know immediately, but is there like, can you give some examples of like, this was obviously incorrect, right? Like, this is obviously how I knew immediately that you were incorrect. It's not that, I think in chat, someone said negotiating and hiring is a lot of good faith, right? It's like, in many ways, I often tell people when I'm hiring, I think of hiring as much like dating. Like, we want to build a relationship. We want to find something that works for both of us. We all need to be happy at the end of the day. And it's the only way this will work long term. And so I'd love to hear from all three of you, but what are some pitfalls that you've seen people encounter when they're trying to sell themselves, right? Like, if there's some common things? And Jenny, it's all yours.
So I would say one of the pitfalls that I see the most, and I want to reach through the screen and shake them, is when you're trying to, like Isa said, like give examples and talk about the work you've done, and same with Chris, saying with the work you've done, give specific examples. People will be sold by you saying the one time you did X or Y. So generally HR questions are, tell me about a time that you encountered a problem you didn't know the solution to. Tell me about a conflict that you had to get others to resolve yourself. They're very generic questions, but what they open the door to do is you to specifically say, I can tell you exactly about one time that I did this. And then you can give a very specific example with lots of detail, mindful of time, of course. And you can toss in some stats and some numbers in there that really sell you and show that you are very competent and capable in your job, but you're not necessarily being boastful about it, because there's no arguing with numbers. It's coming off as much more objective. So I think a lot of people know they're really confident that they can do something and they say, oh yeah, I've definitely done that, but that's not going to win anyone over, make them believe you have. I think you need to make sure that you really emote to people who, what, when, where, why of that, or like the star breakdown of that situation. And if you come in an interview and don't have that pitfall, you're already ahead of like 50% of the other candidates. Yeah.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think I love those open up questions. And I think most people that do interviews do, because it really creates an opportunity for candidates to raise themselves up above field, or to like answer really quickly, and then you're like, oh, this person isn't presenting themselves well. And a good interview, I think, will ask a few questions like that and try to draw it out of you. But if you are not listening very well, that's a huge red flag. Like if you're just trying to stuff the prepared speech you have in your head out from moment one and not listening to the flow of the interview, or not actually building that relationship. Like I love the dating metaphor. If you're not actually in good faith negotiating who you are and trying to sell yourself, but not in a genuine way, just as like I prepared the speech, that is one of the things that starts to make me feel like whatever pieces of confidence are being thrown out there might not be true, because and I do recognize a lot of that comes from anxiety. And so we've built our interview structure to give people a bit of space to settle into the interview from day one, or from moment one. But if you keep that up through the whole interview, that's a pretty big red flag that you're not going to fit very well in our organization.
And it doesn't mean you can't prepare. Like even me with my interviews, look, a lot of these questions, unless they're a very specific technical question, if you can think of 10 examples of things you've really shined in your past 5 years of your career, you can write them down, however you process them, and have them top of mind, even have them on the screen beside you. Guarantee the type of questions you'll be asked, you're going to be able to relate and insert those into it, but it still feel natural and still feel part of it, because you're not memorizing a script. You're just thinking of those situations ahead of time to make sure you remember all the great things you did. Yeah.
Amazing. I would, one of the questions I have are on interview prep, right? Like, I think this is like a great question, and depending on the role you're in, the way you prep might be different. And I think we all will probably, like the three of you, might have different perspectives on this. And so I'd love to start, Jenny, to kick us off, like for purpose of, so I know like in the interview process, you do a lot of you sit sort of, let's say, in the pre-screen, but the whole relationship, but really the pre-screen, how should people think about the pre-screen and actually the interview process itself? And the different stages. And I'm going to pass this around because I think all three of you will have great perspective on this one. But I think it's really important, this perspective of like prep and process and how to think about this, like what is going on in the back end and how do I interact with that and engage with it in a compelling way. But I think the focus on the preparation side of it. Anyways, pass this to you. It's pretty open-ended, but I think it's also very important we have a discussion about it.
Yeah. When I try to help people with like the mindset of interviews and that, I usually try to look at it as you're going to go through a few stages, but the positive to that is you're going to have lots of opportunities to interact with a lot of different people at the company. And you're going to have the opportunity to see how they all vibe, see if you click with them, all of that. So you're going to get a much more rounded view of things in modern interviews than you used to when you just walk into a boardroom and talk to three stern people and that's the end of it. So that's one aspect that is more positive for you. It's going to be a lot more conversational in most companies, especially in the startup sphere. Generally, what I say for the HR interview is you have to remember, I don't work in what you work in. So when you're explaining things, make sure that you're explaining them in a way that I won't say the average, because I still work in tech. I still know the basics. Dropped out of Java because I got mono at Dell. But anyway, but make sure that you are talking in a way that is relatable to the person you're chatting with. And this is actually one of the like unspoken things we use to filter at Fellow is if I'm talking to an engineer and they're talking at me and just completely going technical and not taking any pauses and not checking in with me, sure, they may be demonstrating they are amazing at their job, but your job is not just your technical skills. Your job is also going to be talking to people like me day to day. And that's part of your job too, is tailoring communication to the audience you're speaking to. And that's true of any job. So trying to be mindful of the context of who you're speaking to, tailoring your communication to that person. And just knowing that as you get on further and further in the process, you're probably going to get closer and closer to those that do the job that you're doing. So don't stress about getting all like your technical or day-to-day questions out there in that first interview, because most of the times I look at the candidate and say, I don't know. You'll find out at the next one, politely, obviously. But so don't be too stressed about getting every question answered in the first interview. And don't be too stressed about dealing with each person on their own. You're going to see a trend in how they talk and interact because there's cultures and companies. So I think that's the biggest thing, is making sure you're tailoring how you communicate who you are and making yourself shine to the audience that's in front of you. the internet is a wonderful thing. You can creep everybody. You can find something you relate to every one of the people you're going to meet before, even if it's just their job title. But usually, you know, we have LinkedIn or they'll find you somewhere. I don't really mind that. I creep them. So, you know, that's something to have in your back pocket if you think it's not going to great, and bring up something that's related, like, hey, I'm an alumni at X school, or that sort of thing too.
Amazing. Isa, I'd love to get your perspective on sort of how to approach the different stages, how to think about preparing for the different stages of, and especially like in the context where you're a smaller agency, maybe you have your interview process may be different than sort of more established process at a larger company.
Yeah, our pipeline's definitely a lot shorter. We do interview panel, an exercise for technical roles, perhaps a follow-up interview, but we're pretty confident with that very short process for the people that we're finding, that we can find the right people. And partially that's because we don't have to have as much flow as other organizations. So the prep is a little bit different in that case, but I think, you know, Jenny said this earlier, people who come in having thought about their careers and how they want to present themselves, in not in a speech way, but in a, here are a bunch of ideas that I can pull on when I'm being asked questions. Spending the time to do that really shines in interviews. And then reading the room is really key, like both who you're talking to, because we're a client-facing agency, so we expect almost all developers to have some intersection with our clients. So that's really important from just even a client and work standpoint, but then we're also a very collaborative team, so expecting people to work well with others. And we like the panel process for that reason, because it reveals how they interact with three different people that have different levels of technical skill, different perspectives within the company. And it also gives people a good opportunity to interview us, which is always part of the dance, where they're seeing how we work together. And I think as a candidate, you can pick up a lot of genuine sense, as Jenny said, of like what the internal culture of the organization is through actually just paying attention to how the people are interviewed. You know?
Thank you. That's insightful. Chris, I love your perspective, especially if you were to think more on the technical side of the process phase as well.
Purely on the technical side, make sure you're prepared for anything, because sometimes you may think it's an intro call and they're going to ask you a tough technical question or ask you to do something on a whiteboard, even though you don't have one, or, you know, you can really get thrown in, or system designs questions, things like that. So make sure you're up on all of those things prior to going into any interview. But once you are in the interview and you kind of know what they're trying to accomplish, your goal should be to get to the next phase. Like you don't necessarily have to get hired in your first meeting with them, but you have to make sure you've convinced them whatever they're trying to screen for at that first level, right? So do you have the basic technical skills that would warrant a follow-up interview, right? You need to be able to show those. Another thing is an interview is as much for the prospective employee as it is for the employer. So your goal in an interview is to know if that's a company I want to work for, because you know they might look good on paper, but they might not be a good fit for you. So you kind of want to keep that in mind while you're going through the process. I definitely do your research on the companies so that you know about them, about things like their core values and culture, because most places have that on their website now. Know about the role that they've posted and relate your experience to those. So like take your experience and the stories that you've worked together on what you have, how does that relate to them? And if you can draw those lines, like it'll show how you might be a good fit, because they're going to ask you questions about their culture and their values and stuff like that. And if you can relate your experience back to that, then so you know that's going to happen, and you can research some of that stuff up front.
I love that.
Have questions to ask too. Like you don't want to get to the end of the call and there's 5 minutes left and they're like, do you have any questions? And you say, nope. Like, so you should have more questions that you're going to ask. You don't need to ask them all. You can wait to the appropriate stage. I think you mentioned earlier, I think it was Jenny, but I like, you don't need to get them all answered in that first call, but have a list of questions. So when there is time for questions, you can ask something. It shows that you're like interested in the company, interested in a role, interested in finding out more, like show that you have interest there.
I think these are like a great subject. And I think this kind of brings us to sort of area I want to go to is like, we spent a lot of time thinking, I think talking broadly about interviews, broadly about the process, broadly about like sort of salary negotiations, broadly about like how to think about the process. And I'd love to zoom down to sort of like, what if you're a junior, right? How do, I'm new, it's my first job, maybe I'm looking for a co-op. How do I position myself? Like, I don't have work experience. I haven't done this role before. I'm just trying to get my start. And I think that part, this is always like a very, I think for all of us, I think we can say it was scary our first time. I'm not going for a job that I had in high school. I'm trying to get, my first job in a career. How do I break into it? I think this is often very difficult. And it's a question I saw asked in chat. I think it's a question I hear all the time is, I'm new to the field. I could be new because I decided to switch into it, or I could be new because I just finished school. How do you see those people be successful? What are like some tips for those people to get their start? And I'd love to start with you, and then we'll pass it around. I think all three of you will have great insight here.
I think from the very get-go, having code that's publicly available for a technical role when you're applying is key. Like, it's one of the things we filter on. If we can't see any of your code and you're a junior, there's a bunch of other people that have it, and it's just a way for us to make sure that we're getting candidates that at least know the very baseline that we're looking for. And when we're hiring juniors, we know that they don't have a ton of experience, and what we're really looking for them is to do the thing Chris said, which is relate their experience in other ways to the job. So that can be, if you're coming into university, relating group projects, and that can be the classic thing of, ragging a little bit on being the person in your group that had to do all the work because the other people weren't pulling their weight, but what you did in that case, or how you pulled other people in, like showing the ways that you attempt to collaborate, or talking about a really good collaborative experience at the university level. But if you're jumping from other careers, and personally, I love hiring people that are jumping from other careers that are non-traditional and non-technical into a technical role, really talking about the pieces that have translated for you in the earliest stages of learning how to become a technical developer or something else. Like, what are the things that you unexpectedly discovered in that process that show that you have insight into what it actually takes to be a developer? You don't have to have all the skills, because you can learn that by doing. And I think most developers in the end learn by doing. It's showing that you have the thought process and the insight into what we do as developers in an ongoing way, day to day. And any way that you can tell your story in that way will make me convinced that you're a good person to invest in.
That's a great answer. Chris, I'd love your perspective, and then we'll end off on Jenny on this sort of thought process.
Sure. I think the first thing I'd say is apply even if you don't meet all the requirements of a job posting. So especially if you may have some other advantages that may not be listed there, like maybe you have a side project you did, or something that differentiates you from another candidate, but definitely apply for jobs that you don't fully meet everything for. You're taking a risk, but it's always worth it. The worst thing that could happen is you don't get an interview there, but definitely reach out for that. Unfortunately, where we're at with this buyer's market, it really is mostly for senior. And I think the reason for this is all of these companies went to remote without any experience or plan to go remote first, are not all stuck with it because of COVID restrictions and are now operating as remote companies. But they don't know how to train, they don't know how to mentor, they don't know how to bring on new people in that kind of environment. They're focusing on the people they have and people who can hit the ground running day one. So it's unfortunate, but that is the way it is. So if you're a junior, if you've got very little experience, you can't approach it like you have the upper hand, like it's a buyer's market for you, because it's not at that junior level. It's much more competitive. So like, I think you need to be aware of kind of where that is. And unfortunately it is tough. But what I'd probably suggest is focus on either a hybrid remote in-person company or a remote first company prior to 2020. So like, look at the companies who are doing remote anyway, because you know that they have a good story on how to bring in junior and new people onto the team. Like, look at the bigger companies. They're probably better at doing it. Things like GitHub, GitLab, some of these companies that have been doing remote for many years, they're probably good good opportunities. Shopify is like all remote now too. They hire a lot of juniors as well. So there's a lot of bigger companies that may be able to have the infrastructure to support newer people coming on, where some of these other companies that are just kind of like thrown into remote with COVID don't have the infrastructure in place for it.
I think it's a great segue. I'm actually so happy, Jenny. I think this is because you sit on this sort of angle. I'd love to get your perspective and thinking on this topic. I think Chris and Isa just brought up a lot of really good points. And I think specifically, if we, also tailor some of your answer and thought process to sort of like remote specific plus junior.
Yep. So I will reiterate what Chris said about applying if you don't have all the skills. And I will also point out that statistically, women are less likely to apply if they don't have everything single thing listed on there. I think the stat that I heard in HR conference is women apply if they have 100% of the requirements and men apply if it's 60%. So please, everybody, just apply, be confident. So we've gone through this. We were a remote first company. This is pre-me, before COVID. And we have confidently gone through the junior and intern process a few cycles, including like the hiring for summer this year too. I would say one thing to remember with applying for jobs like that, if you are in a junior position and you're not confident, remember that they know you're junior. It's not like you faked a resume and we think you have 5 years experience. We generally know what we're getting into interviewing you and bringing you on generally. So just be honest and frank. You can use examples from school. You can use examples from another job you have that's not in this career to loop in how you may really have those skills and abilities that we look for hiring with you as an intern or junior, because we know this is a learning opportunity, not that you're going to jump in and be in charge of the entire code base. So that's one thing to kind of hype your confidence is we know where you're at. And if you get into interviews and they're not acting impressed by you and, having good skills for the level you're at, maybe that's a red flag for that org, that they're asking too much or they have too high expectations for someone at a junior level when they're skilled. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Overall, I think if you are a junior person for a remote company, it probably is a little more work on your end because you won't have those natural interactions that you would have in an in-person environment that you can just nudge the person beside you and say, I'm at this point, and you're trying to rubber duck with them, like how to work something out, that you have to actively reach out to people and just being confident that you yourself, like saying to yourself, I'm not going to hesitate to reach out to people. I'm not going to hesitate to ask questions. I'm not going to hesitate to take time out of people's days so they can explain to me. Everybody wants you to ask questions as your junior person. They don't want you to ask the same question 5 times, but they want you to ask questions because they know if you're in a good culture, they've been where you have been, and they know that's part of you learning and growing is figuring things out. And I will tell you, coming into Fellow, this is like manyth company in my career, there was still tons of stuff I had no clue because they're so very, very much company specific. So don't ever hesitate to be the new person asking tons of questions. Most environments will be seen as a positive, and you're going to ramp up a lot faster in your company. You just have to be conscious in a remote environment, but that you're going to have to take much more of the lead in the interacting process because you won't have those casual moments anymore. You're going to have to actually like reach out to people and message and wait and book meetings sometimes too.
Amazing. That was a great answer. I don't know if you wanted to hit anything else you wanted to add to the conversation before we move on. I want to give you the opportunity.
Just reiterating, apply for the jobs, even if you don't think you're qualified. We find great people that way.
Awesome. One of the questions that's come up in chat, and I've completely haven't even looked at my question sheet because there's been such great chat. And Randa, I thank you for helping me sift through all of this. You're the all-star here. One of the questions that came up is like, how do you say, I don't know? Right? In an interview, this happens. It happens all the time, right? Like, is it okay to say I don't know? And how do I navigate a circumstance where something comes up where I don't understand, right? How do I communicate that? And how have you seen that go well? And how have you potentially seen that not go well? And what are some things to watch out for when you encounter some situation interview where you're just sort of like, uh-oh. I'm gonna pass this one to Chris, and then we'll go from there.
I think if it's an I don't know, like I don't understand the question, you can just ask to clarify, like just say, I'm not sure I understand what you mean. And say the question back to them in your own wording of how you understand it and ask if that's the thing. So it's like, it sounds like you're looking for something like this. Is this what you're asking? And that will both give you time to think about it more and give them the chance to clarify if it was a little confusing. It happens a lot of the time where you're not quite understanding what they're getting at, especially if your interviewer isn't experienced, right? Like not every interviewer is going to be really good at asking clear questions. The other I don't know is like, if you don't know the answer to the question, you can also say that too. Like if you don't know the answer, it's okay to not have the answer to every question. If somebody doesn't have the answer, I would be more happy if they tell me they don't have the answer than if they try to make up an answer that is completely wrong. So if somebody says confidently, the answer is blah, and that is not the answer, you don't get hired. There's no way, right? But if you say you don't know, that's fine, especially if you're junior or newer in your career. You don't know, you don't have to know all the answers, but you should know when you don't know. Another way you could go about that is you could, if you think you might know, or you would know how you would approach it, if it's more of a problem sort of a thing, it's like, I don't know the answer. I haven't done that before, but I have done this, and this is how I would approach the problem. The nice thing about that is you're showing you know more than just I don't know. So that's another way that you could go about that sort of a situation.
Guys, I'd love your perspective on this.
I want to completely echo what Chris said. I think the transference to another technical skill is the perfect way to handle this. It's the very honest, I don't know how to do this one thing, but I know how I would figure it out, or I know I'd at least how to begin to figure it out. And that can even be, if you're more junior, as simple as not I would go to my senior, but I would work with my team to figure it out, or start doing this research and then bring it back to someone who's more experienced than me and see if I'm on the right track, like showing that initiative to do some of the work yourself as opposed to completely leaning on the person who's responsible for you, but also that you're smart enough to realize that you need input into that system so that you're moving in the right direction. Another thing I love that candidates do sometimes is, in an I don't know moment, pause and ask for a second, not just to like rephrase the question, but to like, just give me a second to make sure I'm like in my own head, know what I'm answering. And I think as a candidate, there's often a lot of fear about asking for a second just to process it. But I'd much rather the person do that than try to dive headfirst into an answer that, you know, is what Chris said again, the like very confidently answering it, but being completely wrong is a sure way to spike your interview.
Amazing. Jenny, like I'm sure you've encountered this one a lot, so I'm sure you have a great perspective.
To me, Chris's answer was spot on. The only thing I will add as a bit of perspective is I think a lot of times candidates think the worst thing that could happen in an interview is they don't get the next interview or they don't get picked. But I really think the worst case is actually you try to talk yourself into a job and then you get there and you're going to fail because you're not qualified. And that is way worse of a situation than not getting to the next stage in a job you might not be qualified for, or might not have the exact skill set they want, or might just not be a fit. So just remember that not getting the next interview is not the worst thing to happen. And just being honest about the situation is going to end up in a better long-term situation for you than trying to like talk your way into knowing something and tricking them. Yeah.
I love that point. Yeah. Oftentimes I think life is very long. So like mortgaging your integrity is probably the worst thing you could possibly do. I think this is an interesting pivot point to one of the things I really wanted to talk about tonight. And we're coming to near the end. So it's sort of the last couple of questions. And I appreciate our panelists for having such good thought process and answers and all of your amazing questions. As you get further into your career, you know, you get past sort of the junior phase, maybe you're now what we would call an intermediate IC, or maybe you're making your first steps into management of some form, or you're taking on a more senior role inside a company. How should people who are progressing in their career think about the interview process differently? And how should they think about making career progression? I think this is an interesting question. I think it's very open-ended. I'm purposely making it open-ended for a couple of different reasons. And so I think you'll all have different perspective in this angle from this because you're from different perspectives. But Jenny, I'm gonna throw this to you to start us off, since talk about like what are some mistakes you see people making that, like, you know, you may be intermediate going to senior, maybe like going to, you know, first management job. What are some mistakes or things that you've seen, and what are some tips on how for people to think about, okay, I'm ready for the next leap in my career, and how do I approach that from like an interview process perspective?
I think the biggest pitfall people have moving up in their career is thinking their career path is X or Y because that's the natural career path. And the obvious example to that is stepping into a team lead or management position because you're like, this is the next step up in my career and how I advance my career. But that isn't the same job as the technical job or many other jobs. So I would say the first step is being really confident that you know what that job entails day to day. You know how that's different than what you do now. And you know if that's something that you would personally be happy doing. I would say one good step that everyone should be doing before they get to the step of interviewing internally or externally is when you're talking to your manager, make sure you're letting it be known to your manager, this is where I want to go in my career, and these are the skills I want to gain, and being an advocate for yourself, because often, especially in small companies and especially in environments where you're only moving up to that next level where you have a team lead you talk to or a new manager themselves, they may not always know that that's a conversation they should be constantly having with you to develop you anyway. So being your own advocate and saying, this is what I want, or reaching out to people if it's kind of a wild card compared to what you do now, asking to talk to them about what their job is like, seeing what they do, see what they like and dislikes, stuff like that, to get a really strong knowledge base of you're confident this is one of the paths you'd like to take. There may be more than one. And these are the skills I need to get there. Picking up some of those skills ad hoc as you have opportunities, volunteering for things, stuff like that. And then when you get to an interview, you have really solid answers for how you specifically done those things. Even if it's just once or twice, you show that you are being your own advocate. You actively want to develop yourself and get to that next level. That will really help you, because there might be interviews where they're kind of on the fence about who to pick, but they can say, well, this person doesn't have a lot of experience, but they clearly want this. This is a clear path for them. And they know that that person is probably going to be a pretty good performer in that role if they've taken the initiative to develop themselves on their own time too. So it's not necessarily an interview answer, but I think it's just being really sure of what you want before you try to go out and get it, and making sure that you're kind of picking up those like breadcrumbs along the way of little pieces. And when it comes time to present yourself for a job like that, you're ahead of the competition, you're confident. And when you step into that new role, it's just kind of putting all the puzzles of the little experiences you've had together, and you'll be a bigger success too.
It's a great answer. I'd love your perspective on this, especially since you've gone through, entrepreneur, developer, project manager, CEO for your own career, but also in terms of how you've hired people and maybe people that are career transitioning, or they're trying to get to the next stage of their career.
I think in our own organization, we see a lot of people that don't realize they're ready for that step. They might want it, but they don't. They are like, I've only developed this much skill as a developer, so I'm not ready to step into an intermediate or senior role. I'm not ready to be a team lead because I barely know this technology stack that's going to be part of this project. And it takes some nudging sometimes. And I encourage you, if you're thinking about yourself in that way, to look at the people who've been leading the projects you're doing and think about the ways that they've been doing it, and noticing the things that you're starting to step in and be the glue piece for them. And then recognizing that that's actually the skills that you need to step up in seniority. And then having a really good sense of what you'll have to learn as you start that role. So if you're interviewing for a new organization or pitching yourself within your own organization or interviewing in your own organization, being really confident about what you've seen before and how you think you can do it better. Someone who's very gung-ho and excited about growing into a role is a hire that I'll favor over someone with a bit more experience that just feels like not invested in growing anymore as a developer or as a project lead or as a project manager. That excitement is really key. And I think everyone has that experience of like, I'm thinking about this from a parenting lens, but like, you know what other people have done poorly, and you know how you'd want to do that better, and bringing that up in interviews and talking about how you think it should be. And you can obviously put your foot in your mouth in this place if you haven't done the research that Jenny's talking about, but if you're actually excited about the role and have thought about how you could do it better and can present a picture of that, while also being honest about where you're a little weak and you'll need to learn in the role, that is a great candidate to me.
Chris, I'd love you to end us off on this one.
Yeah. So when you're interviewing with a new company, that's probably not going to be your opportunity to make a jump up. So you're probably not going to get to that next level by going somewhere else, because what they're looking for a senior developer, for example, is somebody who is a senior developer. So if you're not already doing that role, you may have a hard time convincing somebody you're ready for that, unless you can really back it up with a lot of experience and background. So how do you move up then, right? Well, you should be working with that on your current team where you're at. And this is something that you should have a discussion with your manager, your direct manager, about, is this is where I want to go in my career. How can we make this happen? And sometimes they can't provide everything for you, especially if you're at a small company with limited roles, maybe they can't provide you exactly what you need, but maybe they can help you develop some of the skills that you would need to do that or prepare you. So, there's maybe some people might be thinking like, hey, my manager, that we don't really talk about career progression. We don't really talk about this and that, it is part of their job. Maybe they're not good at it. Maybe they don't want to do that part of it, but it is part of their job. So just ask them for it, push for it. I think if you push for it, then that will happen. You can have those discussions, and they can know where you want to go, and they can help, create opportunities for you that might lead you where you want to go.
I'm gonna keep this ball rolling just a little bit, because I think this is like a really important conversation. I know we're a little over time, but I appreciate everyone holding on. Jenny, I'd love for you to talk, since you sit in HR. And I'd love to get this last minute perspective, but in terms of like internal promotion, I think, Chris, you said something very clear, which is like, sometimes your manager doesn't talk to you about this. It's their job, and they shouldn't. And I think this is like an important thing we should talk about in a community setting, which is what do I do if my manager doesn't want to have these conversations with me? How should I think about my career and through that lens? And how do I think about potentially searching for new opportunities, or how to make the decision that I need to make a jump to actually realize the career goals I have? I'm going to start with Jenny, and then I said with yourself, I want to give you an opportunity to respond, because this is sort of a follow on from something Chris just said, which I think is actually incredibly important that we talk about before we end.
Sure. Quick plug for Fellow, which is a great manager employee one-on-one meeting, system. But I think if you're not getting what you need out of your manager, depending on the situation, I know not every situation would have space for this. Let them know that and be like, hey, you're my manager. This is what I really need out of our relationship that I'm not getting. Can we start a process to get to there? If not, if your company has HR, that's always an opportunity. If not, reach out to, if there's, someone that's a bit more of a mentor in the company or a mentor in the community for you, reach out to those people. I find in tech, the willingness to help others along their career path is a lot stronger and a lot less gatekeeping than in other industries, because there's so many self-made people in terms of like self-starters who had to self-teach and kind of grind up, that people like seeing that passion. That's also a great networking opportunity for future roles and things too, if you have mentors and stuff like that. But I think ultimately what it comes down to is you may not have control, you may not get what you need out of a situation, but it's your job to make sure that you respectfully communicate in any relationship in business what you need out of the relationship, how you need that, like all of your expectations and requirements, or however you want to phrase them, and asking if that's a possibility, and asking if collaboratively that's something you can work towards. I think a lot of managers are just really overwhelmed and they don't think about these things, and all they're thinking about is, I wish I could just go back to being an engineer, or, like they forget that the vast majority of their job is helping you be your best person, and just making sure that your needs are well communicated to whoever you need to communicate it to in your work. And if that's not happening within your company, to whatever resource you have, start looking elsewhere for at least having that support. I know it's a luxury. Not everyone can leave their job at any one time, but you definitely will find support in the wider community if you have really clear and concise goals, and reach out to people and ask them for their help in those.
I'd love your perspective on this, both as a self-starter, but also as a manager, and also in terms of how you think about this problem broadly.
I think I don't have a ton to add. Jenny covered it pretty well, but I think, remembering that, especially in our industry, because a bunch of us are self-starters, a lot of managers got there by accident. And there's two versions of this. There's a version where they don't know they should be doing this, and there's a version where they know they should be doing it, but it's either not their default strength, or they're just so overwhelmed by everything else that they have to do. And often that reminder of, hey, this is supposed to be part of our conversation, is enough to get them on track. And that does put more onus on the person who should be getting that already. But sometimes that is what's necessary to get the manager over that line as well. But I also think, we are an industry where we do have a bit more privilege than others in terms of job mobility, and recognizing that if you go through all these different avenues, if you're talking to your manager, and whether they're like ignoring that request or attempting but continuing to fail, and then you talk to someone within HR or reach out to other valued members of the team that you can use as a mentor. If you're not getting that momentum that you need, and you're not getting fed the pieces you need to grow in your career, that's a pretty clear sign that you should be looking actively for something else.
Chris, I wanted to give you an opportunity, since we went the whole gambit, to add a thought. If you have any remaining thoughts before we close this out.
Kind of final thoughts. You will have bad interviews that don't go well. Yeah. You will bomb interviews. And you will bomb interviews for places that you would love to work, that you think are great companies. And it can feel really terrible. You're talking about like interview, like dating. I think it's like the same thing. You're going to have messy breakups, or you're not even going to get to the breakup, right?
Yeah.
Totally. But when you do fail those interviews, it's not because you're a bad person, or because you were a bad developer, or whatever your role is. There is a place for you. And maybe it wasn't the right place. And also there are some really bad interviewers out there as well. And just because you failed that test doesn't mean you're a failure or you're bad. So, focus on, go for the next one, right? Try to improve, try to do better. But you will fail some, they will not go well, but it's not a reflection of you. You just need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I'd love to give you a chance, and Jenny will give you the last closing thought. So,
failure, as cheesy as it is a learning opportunity, and you're going to fail a lot in doing interviews, but not a reflection on you. Everything from just the chance to do better to having an off day to a bad interviewer. There's a lot of opportunity, and it's worth trying over and over again to do that. If you're excited by what you're doing, you'll find the right place. And to painfully extend the dating metaphor a bit more, I think most people have had the experience of having a mediocre date and being like, am I excited by this person? Versus the good date where you're actually excited by the role and job. And in my opinion, you should be looking for the jobs that give an interview process that gives you that excitement. And those are the ones you should be running for. And again, this is a privileged take of like, you need a job and what opportunities are in front of you. But if you have that choice, I do think we all know when we're really excited about an opportunity.
Awesome. That's great thinking. Jenny, this is.
Yeah, I would say to Chris's point about bombing interviews, everybody bombs interviews. I actually got in a fight with one local company about their company during the interview once. Just remember that. But don't be afraid to apply again in 6 months or a year if you really want to work for that company and it's like your dream company. They know everyone grows, or they're going to completely forget they met you before. So don't be afraid to pitch yourself again and again too. We all grow and change, and definitely, like the others said, like it's just a process you got to go through. It's painful, but you'll definitely get something. Just be confident and know where your value lies.
I really appreciate all three of you. I appreciate Miranda, and I appreciate everyone in chat. This has been an excellent night. I'll close out and say this has been a pleasure on my side to have this conversation. I think there's some really great advice. I appreciate all of you in the chat. Bruce, I saw you. I can't even pronounce to go back over everyone, but there was some really great discussion in chat. It's been an absolutely awesome event from my perspective. We will be having more of these events, and some of these events, hopefully, as we navigate the pandemic situation and as people feel comfortable, we will be hosting events that'll have both in-person and virtual aspects. So for those that are comfortable to the event, you'll be able to do it in person. For those that still want to retain some social distancing, are not yet ready to venture back to the wide world as we go through this process of, like, how the government described it, living with COVID. We're going to try and support all of you. And if you have thoughts on that or anything we do related to Hella Hacks or the event, please, we have a Slack. If you're not in the Slack, please join the Slack. You can go to the website, hellhacks.com. There should be a button that says add me to your Slack, and you get added to the Slack, and everyone's nice and wonderful, and they have some great discussions. If you're already in the Slack, drop in the Slack and say, I'd love to talk about your events, and here's some ideas I have for you. And I'm sure Miranda and the rest of the organizing committee would be super, super excited to hear your feedback. The next event we'll have, dates not announced, but a little teaser. We're going to talk about data science with some lovely folks in the community. And I'm super excited for that. And the last thing I'll say on interviewing in general is, in life, the only thing you can communicate is how hard you try. And so to what Chris and Jenny and Isa was saying is, like, even if you fail, you just keep trying and eventually it'll all work out. And that's very cheesy, but that's been my experience. I think, yeah. It's good times. Learning is the only thing that matters. All right. I hope everyone has a wonderful night. Bye-bye.